Hello, I'm Steve Hirschhorn, and this is Silent Way Clarified, or the subordination of teaching to learning. Now, look, I've been teaching language and training teachers for about 40 years, and I know that Silent Way was born of the scientific intelligence of Caleb Guiteneau. This all began for him in the 1950s. In fact, when I was about 1954. The question is where to start with this necessarily brief scrutiny of one of the most extraordinary approaches to language learning ever contrived. Perhaps I might be so bold as to start with me. I first came across Silent Way in 1980 when I took the I.H. Hastings, that's in the UK, teacher training course. It was there that I saw some of the elements of Silent Way in practice. No big fanfare, just a quiet, no pun intended, philosophy, which I found very interesting and very attractive. A couple of years later, I returned to the UK specifically to take a training course with Guiteneau himself, an unforgettable experience in which many of my ideas were simply turned inside out and upside down by the genius, which was Caleb Guiteneau. Somehow I managed to attend several other sessions with him and actually got him to run a couple of workshops for myself and colleagues not long before he died. Now, there are many language learning methods and approaches, as you will know, but most are not really associated with the name of their inventors. I suppose there are some exceptions. There's task-based learning and Prabhu, of course, and I guess Suggestopedia and Georgi Lozanov. There's Total Physical Response, TPR, and James Asher. And there's community language learning and Curran. Do you know Charles Curran? Perhaps his name isn't inexplicably linked with CLL. But as far as Silent Way goes, without the association of Guiteneau's name, it's just an empty vessel, in my opinion. His strong, clear influence on the approach, his own character and determination to pass what he saw as essential information for educators led to the adoption of his ideas by many language teachers, particularly in the 1980s. Now, there are fundamentally three parts to Silent Way. There's the philosophy, what we might call the approach, if you want, in general and also specific terms. There's the theory, which is, I suppose, the reasons why certain things happen, why certain things are done, both by teacher and by student. And then we've got the practice. That's the how-to, if you like. And my intention today is to describe the practical applications of Silent Way. And also the demands it makes on the teacher, if any, without delving too deeply into the philosophy. This, however, is not as easy as it might seem, given that some of the practices of Silent Way are embedded in the fabric of the philosophy. They're one and the same in a sense. Nevertheless, I'll try, and for those who are left with questions, which is a Silent Way technique, by the way, I would suggest reading Guiteneau's work, as well as some of the more updated commentaries and developments, including the wonderful book, The Guiteneau Effect, in which many of us who knew him were honored to be able to contribute our own thoughts on the man and also on the approach. It must be said that for many teachers, the shift away from what they currently do to take on board what Silent Way demands is simply too much to ask. It's too much too far. Conversely, one may immediately click in with the simplicity or indeed the common sense of such a way of working. And that's really what happened to me. Silent Way is a way. It's a way for the teacher, but most importantly, for the students who discover a path, a route to a new reality, a new perception of self as a learner, or perhaps more accurately, the rediscovery of a process we followed as pre-speech babies. Let's see where you fit. Let's start by looking at the famous idea of silence, not that imposed by a teacher on student, as is so often the case, but the opposite, silence imposed by the teacher on the teacher. Silent way requires that the teacher remains silent most of the time, and quite a lot has been written about this phenomenon. In fact, the reality is that Gaetano, in a workshop which I was lucky enough to attend, said this: "Why should I speak when my students can?" in answer to the inevitable questions on silence. So the silence is about giving space for students to work, and also for thought, consideration, concentration. I'm always amazed at how much unnecessary talk many teachers use in the classroom. There seems to be a fear of silence. It has to be filled at all costs. But Silent Way teaches that this is not the case. I've heard it suggested that silence is to take the focus off the teacher, but that's also not the case. You can still hold students' attention while being the center of the room, if you want to, and remain silent. Look at this genuine piece of teacher language I recorded as part of a research project. What I want you to do, right, is to talk to your partner. Has everyone got a partner? If not, can you find one? Right, okay. I want to talk to your partner. Kumi, who's your partner? Have you got a partner? Oh, look, can you join Mario and Ahmed to make a 3? Okay, good. What I want you to do is to talk to your partner about what you did last weekend. Okay, everyone understand? Now, both teacher and student need to get used to this new idea that there will be silence, that the teacher will not fill that void, and students can take advantage of it to work and to become more aware. Now, amongst the central tenets or pillars of Silent Way is the idea that the learner takes responsibility for his or her own learning. So I'm responsible for my learning. Also, that I'm independent as a learner, meaning that learners have the means to operate and only they have those means. And then that learners are autonomous, meaning that learners have choices which only they can make. Next is the idea of awareness or awarenesses. This is an important idea in Silent Way because Silent Way considers that awareness is something educable and can be developed, fostered during a Silent Way course. Learners become more aware of what they can do, what they think they can do, and what they expect to do versus the reality. The implications of these important proposals are that the teacher's role is somewhat different from any other classroom. The teacher is a guide who works on the student while the student works on the language. I heard Gaetano say that so many times. The teacher then is a non-judgmental observer. You might wonder what that means, and we'll come on to it a little bit later to look at this idea of non-judgmentalness. The students then work to resolve what they observe. And you may ask, what is it that they observe? I'll try to clarify that too as we go forwards. Students are also actors or doers, creators in the broadest sense of the word. I should also mention, importantly, that neither praise nor criticism form a part of Silent Way. If a student achieves something acceptable with the new language, it's not the teacher's job or business to offer approval. Likewise, if language produced is not conventional or wrong, as we might call it, the teacher may simply say no in a completely non-judgmental tone of voice. This matter-of-fact attitude shouldn't be a surprise to teachers, but it often is. I'm told by teachers that students need praise, that praise motivates them. My experience and my long-held but eminently challengeable belief is that this is simply not true. I find that very often teachers who respond with very good, brilliant, or best of all, perfect, are in fact praising or rewarding themselves. Students will get used to not being showered with effusive acclaim, and in my experience will soon understand the value of having such a simple mechanism available to invite them to work a little more on what they have produced, since that is the purpose of the no. Which brings us neatly on to how we deal with error in silent way. The teacher will offer guidance, perhaps using one of the charts, which we'll talk about in a moment, perhaps using other means. But first, the students should pick up the challenge and try to resolve the matter with their available tools, including their own perception and awareness. As an experienced teacher, or perhaps as a language learner, you'll certainly recognize that often a learner will recognize that they have made an error closely linked to Krashen's noticing. They do this almost immediately as they make the error, and they may try to repair it. I certainly do as a language learner. All too often, the teacher jumps in to try to help, when in fact the learner will gain much more from the process of doing the job without immediate help. The reward for self-contained, the rewards will be self-contained, part of being autonomous, as it were, rather than imposed from outside through the teacher. This applies to both language and errors and of what are called truth. This latter is about the student observation I mentioned earlier. We'll look at that in more detail a little bit later. So let's get to the practice. It all starts with sound and color. I should state that what follows is very similar to what I observed Cuisenaire doing in his own demo classes and what I do, but there are other patterns of a first lesson, notably the very different one included in Earl Stevick's excellent book, A Way and Ways, which I think presupposes a shared L1 amongst students. Cuisenaire proposed that learners' first steps into a language begin with an awareness of the sound system through a color rectangle chart designed for that specific language. Now, each of those colors or color combinations represents a sound or sounds with the vowels in the top section. This chart is on the wall near the teacher, and the teacher uses a pointer to indicate the rectangles. Even the pointer is important for silent way. It's designed to distance the teacher from the language, apart from being a very handy tool, of course. But sounds are not necessarily heard, at least not from the teacher. The teacher will mime or mouth the shape of the sound, unless we're dealing with a consonant or an affricate, which is pretty much impossible to mime. In these cases, the teacher may provide an audio model or might simply draw a diagram on the whiteboard showing how a sound is made. The reason for this is that Cuisenaire knew that when you hear a foreign sound and need to reproduce it, your brain will access the nearest similar sound already stored, rather than trying to create a new sound. Cuisenaire said that babies will instinctively watch their carers' mouths in order to work on their L1 sounds. In effect, the first minutes of a silent way course will do the same thing. Teacher showing the sounds using a pointer and the color rectangles so that students can work out for themselves how the sound system works. The teacher might help a student adjust the sound by showing, for example, where the tongue might be better placed or how slightly more rounded are the lips. This is really articulatory phonetics, showing where and how the sounds are produced. Let's move along. Topic of accuracy. A relatively high level of accuracy is demanded by the silent way teacher, and it's true that this may not sit well with today's focus on intelligibility rather than correctness in language teaching. But I must also say that absolute perfection is never the aim. This is an area which has been misunderstood by some would-be silent way teachers. I once watched a highly experienced teacher working with students on one single sentence for more than 30 minutes, demanding perfection, which was neither attainable nor was it desirable. He was convinced that this is what Silent Way demands of teachers and students. But in line with Adrian Underhill's proposal of demand high, Silent Way challenges students to do more than they thought they could. That's the way that Silent Way works. Whether one is to change that aspect to adapt to today's principles rests with teachers themselves. I must be honest and tell you that I only used a color sound chart in its own right at the start of my journey into Silent Way. I decided that despite Cuisenaire insistence that once learned, one could go on to tackle any of the other languages in the Silent Way portfolio, I felt my students would benefit more from a firm introduction to the IPA. And so I didn't abandon the color rectangles. I simply superimposed the IPA onto them so that students would perhaps subliminally recognize the colors, but would gain a lifelong tool. The IPA, after all, is in all good dictionaries. It's a fabulous resource once learned. But recognizing the colors on the Silent Way chart is important too, as we'll see. So far in our first Silent Way class, students have been introduced, or perhaps I should say have introduced themselves, the sounds of the language they're learning. Note that I've not said they know the sounds. They've begun the process and have developed awareness of the sound system. Next, we'll see that they're introduced to the basic tools of the Silent Way classroom, the famous Cuisenaire rods. The rods come from mathematician Georges Cuisenaire, who Cuisenaire met at a conference, I think in Belgium after the Second World War. Cuisenaire realized the potential of these pieces of mathematically precise colored wood and decided to develop them for language learning. Since the rods are central to almost all that occurs in the Silent Way classroom, at least at the start, it's essential that students get to grips with that word immediately. The teacher then will probably take a rod and point it out from the color rectangle charts. The three components in the word rod, which students will then be able to say if they wish to. They won't necessarily know what it means and may even assume it's a color or a number. That's fine. The next process will clarify that. The teacher takes one of each of the rods and points out the same word, thus eliminating any confusion, since the same word cannot apply to all those 10 colors and lengths. Students might ask each other in L1 if they have a common first language, what this strange word means, but the teacher will ignore that and won't spend time clarifying, since translation is not part of Silent Way at all. Classically, the teacher will then introduce colors using the rods, since they are of different colors and will need to be identified. There are 10 rod colors, and they have a mathematical relationship, which I'm not going to go into today. The teacher then will hold up or put on the table a red rod and point to the sound shapes for red, indicating that students should say this word. Now, it's important to note that the teacher has not said, now look here, chaps, this word is a color, doesn't refer to the object directly. This is the start of what is arguably one of the most interesting processes in Silent Way, that of student discovery and commensurate risk-taking. Students at this point may not know what it is they're saying, but because the teacher has established that he or she knows what she's doing, they will follow. They may even ask each other what the word means, but the teacher will ignore that. The teacher will then take another rod and point out a color. Have a look at this. Let's say did you get it? Students will now get that this is either color or something to do with length, since they are the only variables. The process will continue until all the rod colors have been identified except green. Teachers approach this in various ways, but what I have usually done is to take out a green rod of each hue and place them on the table within reach of the students. Then I point out light green from the color rectangles and indicate that students should say that, but they should also point to the rod they think is being referred to. Likewise, the dark green rod. Now we have all the colors and the word rods. By the way, would you use a glottal stop for light green, or would you teach light green? All these colors are fundamental, since for some time, nearly all the students will be talking about the classroom will be rods. Next, it would be a good idea to point out the symbol for the schwa. I've put it on its color from the rectangle charts. So showing the schwa and eliciting that sound, I use a gentle fist punch to the stomach to indicate this, which generally works and generally gets students laughing, which, while not intrinsic to silent way, is intrinsic to my style of teaching. Now, the teacher introduces another important technique. The teacher will push forward a red rod, for example, and then show the schwa again. Meanwhile, indicating that this is a word, and that, interestingly, perhaps it resides on her hand. In fact, it resides on her right thumb. Note that I've written in reverse to show that we're interested in the student view. They will imagine the words going from their left to their right. Okay? Next, the teacher points at the red rod to elicit these three words, showing that they too reside on the fingers of the right hand. So this is your view as a student. Students now can produce a red rod, and by moving the fingers together, the teacher is able to elicit rapid speech delivery or normal speech speed delivery. To reinforce the colors and the processes, other colors may be dealt with like this, paying special attention to the greens again, since now we have 4 words, not 3, a dark green rod. Students may think that is a number, but that's okay for now. Silent way doesn't necessarily try to resolve all problems immediately. Students can be working on that in their head since they have space to do so. Next, the teacher will move into plurals, since they will that'll enable learners to expand their use once they're over the initial stages. So the teacher may lay perhaps 2 rods on the table and indicate 2 from the rectangle charts. We wait to see what then might happen. In general, students will work this out and produce 2 red rod. Here, the teacher will point at the S color and see if learners can add that plural ending. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they add it to the noun and the adjective, like this, 2 reds rods. To this, the teacher may now use that non-judgmental note so that learners can have the chance to repair. Finger correction would be the go-to tool if they can't manage it alone, pointing to the middle word and looking questioningly. Can you look questioningly? I'm sure you can. The teacher will continue to work on the numbers, perhaps to 10. Now the scene is set for the introduction of a first verb. Any thoughts on what that might be? We're looking for a verb which it'll involve some kind of exchange between learners. Cuisenaire was already thinking about a communicative approach long before Del Hymes published his 1972 paper on communicative competence, which of course paved the way for a radical change in the way language classrooms operate. So the verb most likely to engage learners at this point is take. Since using the techniques we've already noted, the teacher can invite learners to, for example, take a blue rod. Of course, the next step will be to have learners offering each other rods, and this is done by the teacher using a conventional speak to each other sign. In general, give would be the next verb, since it too allows for a great deal of communication. Now, this might be a good time to tell you about the word charts. I'm sorry, this picture is not a very good one. These charts of mine are very old, but these are on the wall of a silent way classroom. And this is the first chart. As you can see, it contains some useful words for this point in the process. So as well as the color rectangles, Silent Way uses 12 themed and color-coded word charts. Naturally, the colors are the same for the words as they are on the rectangle chart. In this way, students have immediate access to what we'll call the correct pronunciation, though I hesitate to use that loaded word. Perhaps I should say the pronunciation to which they have been introduced. Now, this might be a good moment to take a sideways step and mention at least what's called the Fidel chart. The Fidel chart lists all of the spellings of a language and their associated possible sounds. Cuisenaire told me this took him 11 years to complete for the English language. As you can see, the Fidel, a word which comes from an Ethiopian language, is color-coded to match the color rectangle charts and allows for the creation of any word in the English language. Here's the column for the schwa. Look how many spellings are possible for the schwa. It's not extraordinary. To use this, teachers need to invest a considerable amount of time in working out where everything is. Personally, I never used it with students. I felt it would be too much of a load. For me, it was and is a fabulous curiosity. So look, now we have the base noun plus colors, numbers, a plural form, and two handy verbs, give and take. With these, it's reasonable to expect that learners will soon be producing language like this. Mario, take 2 white rods and a light green rod and give 1 rod to her. Or similar. Helga, please give me a red rod and 2 yellow ones, and so on. The teacher will encourage learners to continue working with this combination until it reaches its natural conclusion, or perhaps just before. The best comedians leave the stage at the point where the audience wants more, and that principle can equally be applied to communicative activities. Whether one tidies this up by introducing one and ones as pronoun forms is a matter of choice. Undoubtedly, the result will be more authentic, topic that we're going to come on to later. It's important to note that these communications take place all together. The teacher doesn't indicate who should speak, and they should all be speaking together, talking over and across each other. In short, there should be noise from the students. Earlier, I talked about errors and the treatment of them. I was talking about language errors. Based on the important proposal that learners are observers and commentators, we must also pay attention to the truth of an utterance. So look, if Mario is holding a yellow rod and says, I am hold a yellow rod, this is a language error and will be greeted in the already mentioned non-judgmental way. But if Mario says, I'm holding a blue rod, when actually holding a yellow rod, this is another kind of error, but will be treated in precisely the same way. The non-judgmental response followed by tools to guide Mario in his search for truth. So observation must result in accurate interpretation. If not, it has no real purpose. As well as introducing the basic materials for the course going forward, we're also setting up conventions which will determine how we're going to work. These conventions include: the teacher will not speak unnecessarily, which can surprise learners. Learners will be expected to observe, but will not be told to do so. Correction will be largely self-directed, which can also be a surprise, a shock even. Risk-taking in a silent way classroom is normal. It's expected. It's part of the deal, but never explained. No judgment is applied, neither positive nor negative. Individual students are not forced or even asked to speak. They do so when they're ready. Students have responsibility for their own learning, and they're autonomous and they're independent. There's no course book as such, though other materials will appear as the course develops. Vocabulary is restricted. The only materials at the start of the course are rods and charts, and those remain fundamental throughout the course. We should also mention a most important proposal. All these proposals are important, really. But Cuisenaire said that in order to learn, that is to internalize something, one has to pay for it. In Gatenio's terms, that which we pay with is called an ogden. Now, an ogden is a unit of mental energy involving some kind of conscious investment on the part of the learner and resulting in a return, an item learned. Some things do not normally necessitate any work at all to memorize or retain. Where your living room is in relation to the kitchen, or how you brush your hair, are things which your senses have perceived and didn't involve any conscious effort to commit to memory. Learning a new word or form or structure in a foreign language, however, will require that some mental energy is expended, since these items do not simply appear through osmosis. But Gatenio also put a great deal of emphasis on sleep as part of the process, which reinforces the retention of new items. In this respect, perhaps the only one, his thinking is in line with Lozanov's. I once asked Gatenio what he thought about Lozanov's work, since they were contemporaries, and he responded, he can do whatever he wants. So sleep plays a role, as does meaningful use or practice. By that I mean actual language in use, not the dreary repetition and pointless drills reminiscent of the audiolingual method, for example. It occurs to me, in fact, that the audiolingual method is precisely the opposite of silent way in so many ways, with its futile and damaging attempt to eliminate error, for example, where silent way sees error as a natural occurrence and an opportunity to challenge oneself. I'll leave that thought with you. Gatenio was keen to make learning economical. That is, if you can get two for the price of one, so be it. An example he offers in the common sense is that having paid an ogden for drei in German and another for 10, the combination of both in 13 requires no further payment. Chapter 5 in Gatenio's The Generation of Wealth is called Getting More for Less, the Economics of Education, and deals specifically with this, though in a fairly opaque and profound way. In any case, it behooves the teacher to find ways to help learners access language economically so that they don't use more energy, mental or otherwise, than is necessary. And that, of course, requires a certain analysis. All of these conventions are part of what makes silent way what it is. And on analysis, it will be clear that they have some deeper purpose, but this is not iterated to students. I want to talk for a moment about the 12 word charts. From these charts, sentences can be created. Personally, I only use them at the start of my silent way journey and later for demo purposes. I found them restrictive and actually unnecessary. Gatenio, of course, would disagree and say that they allow for an infinite number of sentences to be generated. But for me, generating sentences is not where we are, nor where we should be. I say this not in criticism of Gatenio, but as a comment for the changing nature of language learning and teaching. I hope we are beyond the fabulously trite make a sentence using the present continuous and into territory which allows for experimentation and self-determination, both of which are hugely part of silent way. If you read Gatenio's description of silent way, in particular the common sense of teaching foreign languages, you'll surely note that there are many examples of language which today most teachers would deem inauthentic. Here's an example from the common sense. Though we can make longer and longer trains with red rods, we need a white rod at the end of a red train to make it as long as a blue rod. And another, this is from my own experience, if you'd given me a white rod instead of a blue one, I'd have been able to make a square. Now, on first sight, these and others which can be seen in Gatenio's writings are almost laughable. One might comment that they're not useful at all. But think again. If we break down these examples and indeed substitute the word rod for another more common noun, what I've done here is to highlight functional structures and handy collocations lying inside there, which students have been able to access without worrying about an ever-expanding lexicon. Does that make sense? So silent way is using a restricted vocab. The restricted vocab idea is not new. Several historical methods have tried and largely failed to teach using that notion. Well, they managed to teach, but it didn't go very far. They failed largely because humans would always try to push the boundaries. And that is why it's very important to note that while the silent way does begin with a restricted vocab, the nouns like rod, table, box, lid, and then the two verbs give and take, this will push learners into communication or kickstart their communications. We are invited, nevertheless, quite early on to develop students' lexicon using the functional word charts or using rods as objects. And the Silent Way book, 1,000 Sentences, which are now somewhat out of date in the language used, possibly the format, but the point is that they exist and can be rewritten or adapted. The rod there is a simplifier, if you like, enabling the building of a skeleton to which lexis can later be attached, a way to free students up from having to pay numerous objects for lexical items, which will then require memorization when they're already working hard on the structural and functional patterns of the language. Well, now, let's just move on to a particularly popular teacher topic, that is testing. The world of language teaching has always been obsessed with testing, in my view. I'm not sure why, since a quick conversation is usually enough to determine where somebody is. I once had an applicant for a teacher training course in an interview. Well, I say interview, but she didn't understand. Hi, have a seat. The interview didn't last very long. There's no testing in Silent Way, since every time a student responds or takes the initiative, they are offering feedback to the teacher and to themselves on what they can do, what they need to do, what they have yet to cover. The aim of the Silent Way class then is not to equip students with exam skills or to enable them to call themselves B2 students or whatever. Is to facilitate students in this new language. I know that many teachers would find this refreshing after being tied to a strict syllabus, which has little to do with functioning in the new language and everything to do with attaining some nebulous level, whether set by the Council of Europe or one of the exam boards. But then, you know, I'm a little biased since I hate language testing, which focuses on the grammar instead of the communicative and strategic competence of the learner. Well, I'd like to try and start tying up some loose ends here and look at some of the things that people say about Silent Way. Let's see if we can have a look at these. This is the first one. Teacher is always silent. Teacher never speaks. I hope I've dealt with that and made it clear that the teacher just doesn't speak unnecessarily. They say that Silent Way is no good for high levels. Manipulating the rods to elicit the third conditional or the past perfect in structural terms, or as part of a role play in which students have to buy or sell houses they've designed, create their own column chart representing sales, or tell a story which adapts its own lexis to students from beginner to native speakers are all eminently possible using the rods since they're so flexible, and all of those things appear in my Cuisenaire book, my book on the Cuisenaire rods, which is going to come out next year. Silent Way teachers never smile, they say. I've heard this myself, and I'm always so disappointed. There should be humor from teachers and from students, whatever method or approach you're using. Silent Way requires language perfection. It never has, and it never will. Each teacher will determine what they demand from students in line with the context of their teaching and presumably the latest research understanding. Here's one I love. Anyone can do a Silent Way lesson. Most definitely not. Silent Way, as I've tried to intimate, is based on a philosophical concept of education. You can't simply do a Silent Way lesson. Since the conventions cannot be set up and created, students can't be prepared in such a short time. And in any case, there's no point. But you can use the rods without teaching using Silent Way. To become a Silent Way teacher requires some properly focused training by people who know and understand what Silent Way actually is. Students are required to feedback on the lesson to the teacher. I've heard this twice in the last 12 months or so, but never heard Gaetano discuss such feedback.
As far as I can see, he never recommended it either. I do wonder whether someone has misinterpreted Gaetano's comments on feedback, which is noted above, is to do with their use of language, offering intrinsic feedback to themselves and the teacher. It follows that a sensitive teacher can pick up where students are. They don't need to ask students where they are, and students don't need to feed back. All that stuff is part of the deal if you're a sensitive teacher. So where does this old and deeply philosophical approach fit into the 21st century? With its teaching and learning, with all the glossy pictures, the online backup, the structurally sequential syllabus, and the pumped up lexicon we expect today? Well, I'll tell you, it's austerity, not opulence. That's the point of Silent Way. It's a lack of bells and whistles. It's got rods and a table and a pointer. It's reliance on the student to demonstrate where the syllabus is going. This is truly a bottom-up context. And it's unapologetic focus on the intellect of both teacher and student. These are the very qualities which challenge today's expectation of making it easy. For most people, the vast majority, learning a language is not going to be easy. It requires Ogdens. It requires real use and it requires time. Anybody who says differently is either ignorant, deluded, or lying. Silent Way makes no pretense to make life easier for the learner. In fact, it's demanding and challenging for both learner and teacher in somewhat different ways. But the reason it's worth it is that both teacher and learner gain confidence, self-assurance, and heightened awareness of the learning process. The awarenesses seem to me to correspond rather neatly with research into what makes a good language learner, starting, I think, with Joan Rubin and H.H. Stern, separately, of course, in the 1970s, to David Nyman in the 90s and beyond. So for me, returning to a bottom-up syllabus, dispensing with the unnecessary jiggery-pokery shoved at us by most of the big publishers, and genuinely turning our attention to our students and ourselves instead of the latest flashy iteration of ways to teach the present perfect can mean massive benefits for all concerned. I've tried to offer an overview of what Silent Way is and perhaps what it isn't. Gaetano, of course, is no longer with us, and so it's difficult to be definitive, especially as his writings are famously opaque. But I've tried to focus on what he considered important by offering practical examples of how Silent Way works. There's no doubt in my mind that there's more to Silent Way than I could offer here. And indeed, teachers spend years interpreting what Silent Way is, what Gaetano meant, what he proposed. If you're interested in learning more, then I strongly suggest you read Gaetano's own writings and then look for people who know more about it than you do. Investigate thoroughly before you open your box of rocks. So thank you for following this. I look forward to your comments and questions. There's some references there, which I'm happy to send anybody. And don't forget the Gallery Teacher's fabulous library, which is available to you, where you can go and look at other recordings. And I'm sure there's all sorts of other stuff going on there too. That's the link is there up on the website right now. Well, if the teacher is silent, then students have space to consider what to do. Instead of being told what to do by a teacher who is in their faces giving instructions, they can work it out for themselves. They have, as mentioned in the presentation, they have responsibility, they have autonomy. And so part of the deal, in a way, within Silent Way, is for them to work out what it is that they want to do or what it is that they need to do. Are the Cuisenaire rods a gimmick? Well, this is a question that I've been asked on many occasions, largely by teachers who have never seen the Cuisenaire rods in action. So they're a fabulous resource which allow for a huge amount of flexibility in terms of creating actions which lead to structural a commentary, for example, also narrative in terms of telling stories and so on.